Okay, in part 3, we're looking at Bourdieu and the cultural dimensions of class. So Pierre Bourdieu is probably the most influential social theorist on my own work. I've used Bourdieu a lot in my own work. I'm particularly kind of identified with Bourdieu work when I was an undergrad and started kind of reading about class and inequality, particularly when it came to kind of education systems and my own experience with the education system and observations of it. And more broadly, my own interest in kind of taste and music and stuff like that. Bourdieu's work is really interesting for thinking about those things. Bourdieu, kind of starting writing in the 1960s through to his death in 2002, brought together lots of different sociological perspectives. You'll see elements of Marx and Weber and Durkheim in his work, very influenced by Nietzsche and other philosophers as well, kind of originally trained as a philosopher. And, you know, on a kind of overtly simplistic level, brings together an understanding of a class that fuses together both economic and cultural understandings. He does this using kind of Marx's metaphor of capital, but expands the definition of it out to cover more things. He's particularly interested in seeing how class reproduces intergenerationally and through institutions. A key concept that Bourdieu developed is the notion of habitus. Habitus is the kind of way that we're socialised into the world, into a particular class position, and this kind of socialisation means that we develop unconscious and embodied ways of being in the world, of enacting our class position, and this is largely done through learned dispositions. We develop these kind of dispositions to engage with the world. So this is kind of similar to socialisation. But what this kind of generally means is the habitus is this mechanism within us that as we navigate through day-to-day life, we'll feel more comfortable in some situations than others. We'll have kind of intuitive understandings of some situations or some peoples or symbols or whatever, more so than others, largely based upon where we were born and how we were brought up. A broad way of kind of thinking about what this notion of habitus is a feel for the game. Bourdieu used kind of quite sporting metaphors of life as a game and the way to win and get ahead of the game. He developed some of these concepts for thinking about that. The habitus is this kind of instinctual feel for the game. So it's a really key thing that Bourdieu developed. A second development is this notion of capital, and Bourdieu developed kind of three forms of capital. Economic capital is very much the Marxist idea, the kind of sum of financial resources that someone has, their money, their property. But importantly, he develops this idea of cultural capital. Cultural capital is kind of through the habitus in terms of the embodied form, again, that kind of sense of being comfortable in some places and not in others. So if you've got, lots of cultural capital, you'll feel kind of comfortable in, say, an art gallery where you might understand art history, or you might understand the difference between Dadaism and Surrealism. If you don't understand that kind of stuff, you'll go into spaces like those things and feel uncomfortable. And from a Bourdieusian point of view, what that means is that people that feel uncomfortable in some social situations will actually kind of exclude themselves from them. It's not like that anyone can't kind of go into an art gallery. It's just that people from a certain background go into those places because they have more affinity with them. People from more disadvantaged backgrounds that don't have that kind of training or understanding tend to not be interested in art because they feel like they're excluded from it because of the specific kinds of knowledge that you need to understand it. Same kind of things, with like fancy restaurants. Even kind of relatively kind of upper working class people that earn lots of money don't go to fancy restaurants because they're just not into kind of the symbolism of, fancy fine dining and having, 3 different forks or whatever. So that's the embodied kind of thing. People kind of have these affinities with some things over others. There's the objectified, and this is the stuff you have as well. So it kind of doesn't directly relate to economic capital, but like having lots of money helps you buy stuff. But the objectified capital is more about like things like books and artworks and musical instruments, or in today's world, the right technology. So you can see how money is important to get those things. But it's like something like books, most people can afford them or not. It'll be then specific types of books, more about literature or social theory or whatever. Business will be kind of valued more than, say, fantasy literature or romance literature and stuff like that. Then there's the institutionalized forms of cultural capital, and that's essentially your qualifications. The embodied and the objectified, having lots of those things, are more likely to see you have higher institutionalized forms of capital. So a way of thinking about this is that, like, there's been lots of studies shown that, like, just having lots of books in the house will kind of almost map directly onto people's educational success. It's not the books themselves, it's just the kind of normalization of reading that will advantage kids at school. Obviously, having parents that are well educated also helps in the sense that, you know, they can help you through the education system. If you have more of this embodied objectified capital, you're more likely to go to uni. If you have lots of it, you're more likely to go to a kind of high status uni. And all these kind of rankings and hierarchies matter when it comes to, you know, how well you can get ahead in life. So again here, Bourdieu is fundamentally challenging the idea of meritocracy. The idea that working class kids do worse at school is not about intelligence, it's not about ability, it's more about their position in the world kind of puts them in a place where they're kind of starting behind the starting line. They have to almost learn to be middle class to be good at school, because it's largely middle class interests and values that are taught there. They kind of have to go to school to learn to be someone else, where more advantaged kids can go to school and just kind of be themselves. These kind of micro-interactional differences are really key to understanding how Bourdieu thinks that inequality maintains itself over time. So, in this sense, all human action, all the things we do in day-to-day life, takes place in what he calls social fields, where people are kind of in constant struggle for the resources. Fields, from Bourdieu's point of view, are the kind of large social institution kind of things like education, politics, media, the judiciary and law, sport, all these kind of things. Each field has its own kind of things that are rewarded, but to do well in them, you have to have the kinds of capitals that are needed to relate to those rewards. So while different fields are kind of differentiated, really people from advantaged backgrounds tend to be able to do well in a kind of wider variety of fields because they have the capitals to do so. In this sense, individuals, institutions, and other people, agents, try to distinguish themselves from each other and acquire capital that's useful to kind of get advantage in a particular arena. For Bourdieu, though, the kind of game, the struggle, is stacked, because those in privileged positions in important fields, art, legal, academia, politics, business, science, media, have usually got there through the deployment of cultural capital. That is, they're kind of predisposed to be able to kind of have a lubricated trajectory through that field, often because they have kind of advantages to do with cultural capital, their parents are well educated, they have the right contacts. And the third form of capital that Bourdieu sees as important is social capital. They know the right people, they're in the right networks, and they're not excluded from these spaces like people without social capital are. So while money is important, these cultural and symbolic aspects are just as important for Bourdieu to kind of understand how class systems work. It essentially reinforces class systems because people then get to be the ones who define what's right and wrong, legal or illegal, tasteful, vulgar. And really what's happening there is not any kind of objective definitions going on. They're just kind of reinforcing their own ways of life and their own worldviews. People that kind of take up these powerful cultural positions get to do that. Now, in the kind of Marx and Weberian terms, the people that have lots of cultural capital are kind of not the ruling class. They don't own the means of production, but they tend to have higher status white-collar jobs. So they have higher status, and they get to work in institutions that are the ones that kind of define how things are meant to be. They're not always kind of heaps well-paid jobs. They're normally kind of above the average or the median or whatever. So these people don't tend to be rich, but they can get other kind of social rewards through their cultural capital, what Bourdieu therefore calls symbolic capital. So people like artists in particular can have quite a lot of prestige in society, even though they might not necessarily be rich. And the artistic world, Bourdieu points out, is kind of, used to be at least, the economic world reversed, that art was more about kind of authenticity and self-expression than making money. Maybe today that's not so much the case. So in terms of what Bourdieu did in terms of his sociological studies, he did really groundbreaking and huge studies on the media, on consumption, in the kind of most influential book called Distinction. He kind of grounded and started his work in studies of education. Huge studies to kind of point out the way different economic and cultural capital relations kind of help determine who gets ahead in life. Something like this is an example of how the relations to economic and and cultural capital can be expressed, say, through food. We can put things in different categories based on like lots of cultural capital or less cultural capital, or being more expensive and less expensive. Now, it's important to see maps like this as not static, not kind of eternal, that they constantly change over time. I think I used as an example in an earlier lecture, sushi, 30 years ago was kind of in Australia almost exclusively in high-end restaurants, would have been like both probably high economic and cultural capital. But today, something like sushi has probably moved down as an expression of taste because it's much more widely available, seen as healthy. You see kind of tradies eating that kind of stuff now. Importantly here, it's not just about like putting things in categories. What this kind of means is that there's relations of distinction that happen here. That people that want to kind of do a performance of self in that Gossman-esque sense tend to kind of know how these kind of systems work, and are more likely to express their kind of status through these kind of formations of taste by eating the right thing or owning the right car or wearing the right stuff. So cultural and economic capital here come together again, but like knowledge about, say, fashion, for instance, doesn't necessarily mean you have to have lots of economic capital. In something like the fashion business, people with no economic capital are often be the cool, edgy ones. They'll make something cool, and then it'll be kind of co-opted by those with economic capital, and it'll kind of lose its edgy cool and not be cool anymore. So again, you can see how this kind of static representation of these things on the page aren't meant to represent the reality of how things actually work. They change over time, again, based on the relations between cultural capital and economic capital. So in this sense, one of Bourdieu's most famous quotes is taste classifies, and it classifies the classifier. So what Bourdieu means by this is that the things that you like, the things that you consume, classifies you. It'll put you somewhere in one of those kind of class categories, I suppose. But the way that someone classifies you, so by maybe associating your music taste with being kind of good or bad, also therefore classifies them. So you can see the real relational nature of what's going on here. So on the one hand, there's kind of official rankings of cultural capital, what can get you into kind of better schools or be better at education or whatever. But really those relations are kind of quite subjective, and people relate to each other by making judgments about those things, which therefore classify them in the system as well. So in these terms, social subjects distinguish themselves by the distinctions they make between the beautiful and the ugly, the distinguished and the vulgar, in which their position in the objective classifications may be expressed or betrayed. So what can we kind of use as examples here? Something like, say, tattoos, for instance, where some people will see a particular tattoo as being kind of cool and edgy and beautiful, or others will see it as vulgar. Your classification of that thing classifies you, and it classifies the classifier. Same thing goes with music taste, fashion, all the kind of everyday judgments we make about things. This is what Bourdieu calls distinction. In some ways we kind of perform ourselves to distinguish ourselves from others. In other ways we'll kind of do things to associate with others. But this is the kind of role that kind of taste plays in day-to-day life. Taste therefore maps on to class position, not deterministically, but through these kind of symbolic mechanisms. Importantly, these taste relations result in what Bourdieu calls symbolic violence. And symbolic violence is one of the key ways that inequality and class systems maintain and reproduce themselves. Essentially, those without cultural capital, those that kind of enter various kind of social fields without kind of the everyday knowledge that they need to kind of get ahead, experience symbolic violence. Symbolic violence is this kind of idea that those that are being kind of discriminated against or marginalised often almost participate in their own marginalisation because they take on the kind of roles that are ascribed to them. You can hear echoes of some of the stuff we've been talking about earlier in the course, where they kind of in some ways might reject what they're being rejected from, exclude themselves from spaces that they don't feel comfortable, but also will kind of almost self-performatively play out their roles because of the way that they've been treated or the way that they feel. This is particularly done through language. Language is one of the key disseminators of symbolic violence, the way that people are categorized, judged, and stereotyped. And you can see this in kind of, symbolic violence works through everyday language in terms of making hierarchies and forming relations of inclusion and exclusion. We'll look at like ethnicity and race in future weeks, but the way the term ethnic is used in day-to-day life is a good example of symbolic violence. The way that it's used in day-to-day life is to talk about ethnic minorities, those that aren't the kind of dominant group in society. So the definition of ethnicity there is skewered. Of course, ethnic or ethnicity just means any kind of cultural group. But the way that it's used always has connotations of minorities in a country like Australia, where, you know, white kind of colonial people are also ethnic, but they're not labelled as ethnic. So it's a kind of nice example of it there. You can see it in further ways we pointed out in the course so far, developing and developed world, first and third world, doesn't really map on to kind of, you know, dominance and population all that much sometimes. I think I've used the example of bogan and dole bludger already. I've written extensively about the bogan and hipsters in my work. The term boat people is another one about, migration and refugees over the years. The kind of idea that these people are somehow, another one is queue jumpers. The idea that people kind of fleeing persecution and violence can somehow get in some kind of bureaucratic line to, or queue to kind of migrate is absurd. But again, this is kind of used in these ways to promote certain kinds of politics over others. So people experience this symbolic violence. This power confirms individuals' higher placements over others in hierarchies or their lower places, and it naturalises these views. This is a form of symbolic power, and it's maintained through what Bourdieu called misrecognition. Of course, symbolic power doesn't necessarily require dominator to put the person on the lower rung. It requires the dominated to accept their position in these exchanges of social value that occur between them. So symbolic violence, I think, is a really useful understanding of how inequality works and how it's experienced in the everyday life. Okay, I'll leave the Bourdieu synopsis there, and I'll come back in part 4 to kind of sum up and talk about class today.